They've got curved swords! Curved swords! But are they too curved? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, I deal in lots of antique swords, and here's one that's come through my hands. This is a rather well sharpened, I have to say, what the Georgians and early Victorians would have described as a scimitar. That's right, the D&D term does apply to real history in a sense. The word scimitar itself seems to be a derivative word from shamshir, essentially the Persian word for a very curved sword. And this type of blade is found on Middle Eastern swords, it's found on North African swords, and it's also found on Indian swords. But this particularly curved blade seems to have originated really in Persia and, you could say, the top of the Middle East and North Africa. And it spread from there. It spread to India, but it had also spread to Europe as well. Now, sabres, if we call them that, sabres had found their way to Europe really quite early on, as early as the time of Charlemagne, 8th and 9th century. However, they experienced a real surge in popularity amongst, shall we say, Christian Western European nations in the 18th century. This was especially cemented during the Napoleonic Wars in the Egyptian campaign, where Britain and France were duking it out in Egypt. Britain won, no spoilers, but essentially lots of generals there and high-ranking staff took back Mamluk or Ottoman shamshirs, sabres, kilich as well, various types of curved sword, and they took them as trophies and they wore them. And in the generations after that, or even the years after that, European makers started emulating them, such that, yes indeed, sabres had been around. If I just grab here the 1788, so that's the British 1788, there are Polish and Hungarian and Prussian and French and Italian and Spanish equivalents of this. So sabres had been around and popular, particularly for light cavalry, in the 18th century beforehand, but really during the Napoleonic Wars it suddenly became very popular to have these extremely curved blades on certain officers' swords, particularly for light cavalry officers and also infantry officers. Now, why infantry officers? And that's specifically what we're going to be looking at here, because this, I believe, is an infantry officer's sword, although some people might argue it could be a light cavalry walking out sword, in other words, a dress sword. A little bit difficult to tell, but I think it's probably a non-regulation infantry officer's sword of the probably 1796 to about 1805 probably. And so this is the type of sword that would have been carried by some infantry officers during the Peninsular War. And anybody who's familiar with the Sharp novels, incidentally, this is the type of sword that Sharp initially was equipped with when he became an officer in the Rifles. If I remember correctly, he broke it, and it was replaced by, or at least it was certainly replaced by, the 1796 heavy cavalry palash of his commanding officer who died and gave him his sword. And everybody knows that heavy cavalry sword from Sharp, even though it was completely inappropriate type of sword to be carried by an infantry, or in this case Rifles officer. Anyway, back to the curved sword. This was a type of sword that became very, very fashionable because it alluded to the Orient, it alluded to the exotic East, whether it be India or the Ottoman Empire or the Middle East or North Africa, Egypt. This was a type of sword that became very popular at this time. However, was it functional? Did it have any benefits whatsoever? Well, a lot of people have criticised these swords over the years, but do you know something I've noticed is that very often these particularly curved sword blades are actually no-nonsense swords. They very rarely have decorated blades, at least in my experience. They usually have relatively utilitarian hilts, and bear in mind these are private purchase, these are officers' swords. So these are something that an officer, a well-heeled and fashionable officer, went out and bought with their own money, presumably wanting to show this is the sword that represents the kind of guy that I am. And they are not particularly ornate, so you'd kind of think, well, if they were showing off with these extremely curved blades, wouldn't they go for something really ornate? At least, you know, a decorated blade, maybe blue and gilt, maybe etching, engraving, or wouldn't they go for a really fancy hilt? But no, as you can see, I mean, this is a really typical example. It's in nice condition, but you can see it's a completely plain blade with a very well sharpened edge, and I'll come back to that in a second, and a 1796 light cavalry inspired hilt with that kicked out guard, P-shaped guard, brass fittings as was common with infantry officers and also for naval officers incidentally, and a horn grip with silver grip wire. So it's nice quality, But it's not incredibly fancy. It's not an incredibly expensive sword for its time. It's probably a kind of medium value sword of its time. And yet it's got this extremely curved blade. And the sharpening point I said I'd come to, one of the things I've noticed is with these extremely curved blades, nearly all of them that I've had through my hands have been really well service sharpened, which would imply that they're not dress swords, they are fighting swords. Because these swords were manufactured to be semi-blunt, essentially, not quite sharp, and usually they were only sharpened when going on active service. And yet most of these seem to be really well sharpened. So the conclusion that I would come to is these are fighting swords. These are swords that people chose for some kind of benefit. So what benefits do they offer? And what detriments do they have? Well, before we answer that, I need to insert some context into you. So the standard sword for most infantry officers at this time was a spadroon. Now, we've spoken a lot about spadroons on this channel, although I have to say, I haven't spoken about spadroons for a while, and it actually feels quite familiar and nostalgic to be talking to you here again about spadroons. But spadroons are essentially thrust-centric swords that can also cut. So they can have double-edged blades, they can have single-edged blades, they are usually straight, they are relatively narrow, they can cut in the same manner that a rapier might be able to cut, so they're not cleaving swords, but they can give a cut that will do things to people and have an effect. But they are primarily straight thrusting swords. And not always, but very often they have this type of boat shell type guard with a knuckle bow and a simple separate pommel. Sometimes they don't have the boat shell, sometimes they just have a D guard or whatever, okay? But they generally have relatively minimalistic hilts, but often more hand protection than you'd find on a light cavalry sabre, or indeed on the curved sabre that we're looking at here. So they tend to have more hand protection, they balance a bit closer, and they are more thrust centric. And they were intended to be used essentially like a big beefy small sword. So if you were familiar with foil fencing, aka small sword fencing, then you could apply everything you know to that method to the spadroon, just adding in some of the backsword or sabre cuts, and boom, you're doing spadroon fencing. So this was the default sword. Now some officers weren't happy with the spadroon, and so they went to cavalry sabres, okay? Now cavalry sabres obviously are bigger, are heavier, they're more robustly built, they are great cutting swords, they're less nimble than a spadroon. Depending on the type, they're sometimes less adapted to thrusting due to curvature or the shape of the tip or whatever, or just because they're less nimble. And this is the kind of beefy end of the spectrum. So you've got spadroons, and you could say small swords as well. So small swords and spadroons at one end of the spectrum, and you've got cavalry swords. And if you're Richard Sharp, all the way up to a heavy cavalry palash, it's not even a sabre, it's a straight chopping sword made for heavy cavalry, at the other end of the spectrum, and other forms of cavalry sword. And then, therefore, this type of sword, this very light, very curved sabre, actually sits in the middle, because it's extremely light, and it's very, very nimble. It's also very, very curved like a cavalry sword, and has a hilt in the style of a cavalry sword. And just for those of you who like the numbers, I just weighed this, and this is 630 grams. So it's pretty damned light. That's heavier than most small swords are, but it's lighter than some spadroons are. It's about the same weight as a spadroon, but just in a different shape. So, you know, what are the advantages and disadvantages of this particular choice over, shall we say, and compared to a spadroon? Well, the first thing, obviously, is the blade shape. One of these swords is straight and thrust-centric, and the other one is curved and cut-centric. And in many ways, this is the most fundamental point to make. We're really here talking about the difference between cut versus thrust. Now, I'm not going to make this into a big video talking about cut versus thrust. Everybody knows that the thrust is potentially more fatal. However, it can be more insignificant depending where it lands. The cut can sometimes be incapacitating or can stop an opponent without necessarily killing them. And the thrust enters a person's body and the cut passes through it. And of course, a thrust moves in a straight line, and a cut describes part of a circle. So in fencing terms, these are almost two opposites, but they're kind of not, because bear in mind that the spadroon also cuts some of the time, and theoretically you could stab or thrust with the sabre some of the time as well. It's just that most of the time you're going to be thrusting with this, most of the time you're going to be cutting with this, and that has a different physical effect on the opponent when you hit them. Now, it should also be mentioned that because this is a straight blade and this is a curved blade, they actually have a similar amount of steel in them. This is something many people don't think about. They look at the spadroon and they say, well, the spadroon is a longer blade. Technically, if we measure around the curve, you'll actually find, if we measure it like this, that the curved blade will actually come out about the same as the straight blade. If we could straighten out and heat up to forging heat that curved blade and hammer it out straight, you'd find that you've got a similar amount of steel in this curved blade as you have in the straight blade. But yes, indeed, in their final shape, if we're reaching forwards, the thrust will be able to hit the opponent with the straight blade before the curved blade can even contact. And that effect is made even more compounded by the fact that the thrust first makes contact with the tip, whereas a cut first makes contact about here and then drags the rest of the blade through. So not only does the curved blade mean that I have a much shortened range, but it also means that because I'm hitting there and I'm cutting rather than thrusting, I have to be much, much closer to my opponent. So if we just compare this for a second, the reach that I have with a spadroon with the thrust is the full length of my arm plus the full length of the blade. The reach I have when offending an opponent with a cut with the sabre is actually the full length of my arm plus only about 18 inches, maybe 20 inches at best of the blade. And this is only a 28-inch blade. Bearing in mind I'm going to be making contact about 8 inches down from the point, so about 20 inches, and then dragging the rest of the blade through the target or across the target, that actually means I have to be a lot closer to my opponent. The spadroon has about a 32-inch blade. So that's about 12 inches, that's about 1 foot or 30 centimetres reach difference in being able to offend the other person, whether it be with a cut or with a thrust. Now you could also say that in some ways, in defensive terms, this sword appears to be weaker or inferior in defence than the spadroon. Why? Firstly, less hand protection, okay? Secondly, less reach, okay? You've got more blades sticking out in front of you with the spadroon. And thirdly, point of balance. So the point of balance is not crazy far out on the sabre, but you can see that it's about 7 or 8 inches from the guard. Most spadroons, however, it's not true of all spadroons, but most spadroons balance far closer to the hand. That's only about 3 inches. So it's about twice as far. The central percussion is about twice as far with the sabre. That's because they're different types of swords intended for different purposes. In terms of where the mass is, it's also because we've got a lot more metal on the hilt of the spadroon here than we do on the sabre. But the fact is this is a cutting sword, so you want the point of balance to be further from the hand. This is a predominantly thrusting sword, so you actually want the point of balance to be closer to the hand. So in defensive terms, you could say this one is a little bit slower, if we want to term it like that. It's got less hand protection and it's got less blade in front of it. So is it inferior in defence? Possibly. In terms of how you hold the sword, that's also important as well, because this type of curved sabre, you don't have much hand protection. So your guard positions are going to be things like prime and second. They're going to be a retracted form of terce or medium or carte down here. So you're maybe if you're practicing more Eastern European styles, they might be a vom tag equivalent, a high guard guardia di alta type equivalent up here as well, and perhaps a window. So the hand is brought back. That means that to defend, you do have to bring the hand out actively or countercut into the cut, perhaps sometimes with a step or a passing step, depending what type of footwork you're using. Whereas the spadroon is going to be, because of the nature of the hilt and the fact that this is a point-centric fencing style, is going to be held out in front of the body, which means that again, you're presenting the weapon in front of the body, which theoretically, some people might argue, I wouldn't fully incidentally, but some people might argue is better defensively because you're keeping the opponent further away and you're keeping the weapon further from your body and closer to the opponent, which makes defense in some ways simpler and more visceral, more obvious. Whereas in order to defend with the curved sabre, which is kept with the hand further back, you have to extend the sword out and cut or parry to do it. So you could say in defensive terms, in other words, an officer defending themselves, which you've got to remember, these are weapons of defence on the battlefield. They're not, the officer's not expected to be running around cleaving down enemy ranks. They're supposed to, essentially, this is for a last-ditch defence of themselves, usually against someone with a bayonet. As a defensive weapon, you could say that the spadroon is a better choice than the sabre. So at this point, you might be starting to wonder, Matt, surely you're just singing the praises of the spadroon here. What is the point of this type of infantry officer's sabre with a highly curved blade? Is it just fashion? Is it just that people thought they were awesome? what possible advantages do these have? Well, they do have some, okay? Now, the first one that I'm going to start off with is actually incredibly simple. So simple, I think, that lots of people overlook it. And that is that under pressure or through lack of training, most people tend to hit. Okay, now given that most people's natural inclination, if I just grab a stick, when someone's under extreme stress, whether, you know, because they're being attacked, or indeed if they just don't really know what they're doing, and you give them any stick-like object, most people's natural response is to flinch, defend like this, or like this, to put things up to cover their head, and then to respond, bam, like this, with a downwards cut, or sometimes a sideways swipe, bam, okay? Now, if their inclination is to do that, they're actually more likely to have success with this sabre than they are with this spadroon. The spadroon, I would argue, to be an effective weapon, and it can be a very effective weapon, requires more discipline and more training. If you are trained to fence, I would argue that this is the better weapon. If you keep a very cool head when people are trying to kill you with bayonets, I would argue this might be a better weapon. However, if you are not very well trained, or you are more likely to respond to your instincts, then I would argue this might be a better weapon. Because the fact is that while thrusts, for example, I mean, if we're just talking about attacking, you know, riposting, or attacking a person or defending yourself and then responding, which is a riposte, actually landing a thrust on someone in a place that's going to incapacitate them requires some degree of training and practice, whereas just hitting someone downwards on any part of their body, be it their shoulder, their arm, their head, obviously their neck, with one of these, is going to leave a massive great old gash and have an immediate debilitating effect on them. Potentially they could bleed out if you hit them in the neck. If you hit them in the head, you might stun them. You might just put them out of completely laid out on the ground. You might knock them out. If you hit them on the arm, you might sever tendons or muscle, incapacitating them immediately, even though they won't die from it. Whereas I myself have seen blades inserted in people, unfortunately, and the fact is that very often people get stabbed, don't even realise they've been stabbed. They just carry on doing what they were doing. In modern knife crime, sometimes people are stabbed multiple times, 10, 15 times, and they're still fighting back and they're still doing things. They still somehow sometimes run off and try to run home or try and run and get help, and they're full of holes. So thrusts often do not have the debilitating effect, depending where they land. Obviously, if it's in a throat or a head or a heart, that they will do. But in many parts of the body, they won't. Whereas a lot of the time, a cut, an instinctively given flinch response smack, will have more an effect. Moreover, there's another thing here. Let's think about context. When an officer needs to pull a sword out and use it, it's a bit like the video I did recently about Kukri versus Fairbairn Sykes dagger. It's often going to be in very close distance, in a horrible bloody melee mess where everything's just gone to shit and people are trying to stab and bludgeon each other with the butts of their muskets and with the bayonets and everything else. And in that situation, if you're all rammed up close against other people, this spadroon is actually a really difficult weapon to deploy because you're trying to get the point into people at extreme close range. You can punch them with the hilt, but if you try and bash them with the blade, it's a rubbish cutting weapon, to be honest. Whereas at this range, suddenly this curved blade, which is sharp all along, it's difficult to grab, difficult to grapple with, suddenly comes into its own because you're now at very close range to people with a weapon that you can move around at close range and be slashing all over. And especially even if you're just stuck up here defending yourself like this with prime second high cut, high terce, and then just slashing downwards, you can offend people basically, bam, at punching distance with the edge of the blade that's going to have a decent effect on them. So actually, in brawling distance, if you think kind of like trench raiding distance, I actually think this might be a better weapon. There's one final thing, okay, and this is kind of out of the left field. The extreme curvature of these blades does, with a bit of training, give you some other options. And I actually use this in sparring myself because I have 3 sabres that I use in sparring. One's straight, one's slightly curved, one's really curved. And the really curved one, you can often nail people with the point because it comes around their blade. So with some training, if you come in with the front edge here and they defend, you can come around with that and go "Pdum," and nail them in the face. You can equally come upwards into the hand with this point like this. So actually, all of this time we've been talking about this as a cut-only weapon and not being able to thrust. That point is actually quite pointy and it's sharpened. So actually, if you know what you're doing and if you target things where it's going to have the most effect, such as hands, groin and face and neck, then actually you can get this point into places really quite deftly from angles that people don't see it coming in at, because it comes around a bit like a show tell. It comes around their defence. So I would say that this is not at all a useless weapon, and actually if we talk about the context that swords were actually used at this time, they predominantly, military swords were not used for duelling, at least not by the British military. They were in the French, but in the British military they were predominantly used as weapons of last-ditch defence for officers when things went wrong. And when things went wrong, when your lines were broken and when the cavalry was amongst you or the enemy French square had broken, so a French column had broken your line, in that situation you're going to be predominantly facing people with muskets and bayonets, and you're predominantly going to be in a close-in brawling melee. And actually in that situation I can totally see why these extremely curved sabres, which let's remember were very popular in India, the Middle East and North Africa, why these very, very curved sabres actually became popular over what seems to be the superior sword for the one-on-one duel and fight. Actually, in a brawling military situation, I can see why these sabres came into their own. And indeed, in some situations, why people preferred just to carry a cavalry sword. And I suspect that there were actually more infantry officers carrying cavalry swords than we maybe realise at this time. Anyway, I hope that's been thought-provoking and interesting. If you've got further thoughts, things that I missed, things that I overlooked, things that I should have mentioned, and you just feel that I need to know about it, then post below. And also suggestions for future videos as well. If you don't catch another Happy Christmas message from me before Christmas, then Merry Christmas to you all. But I'm going to be continuing to make videos, so you'll see more of me over this period. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.